I had to now learn how to adapt. And it's still a struggle every day. I don't ever say to people, hey, I'm Leland Vittert and I have autism. And, when I was in 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, as you noted, crying myself to sleep, my dad's refrain to me over and over again always was, the qualities and characteristics of your character that are making you bullied now, that you're humiliated for, that you're beat up for, that you're isolated for, are going to make you successful later in life. Now, I didn't necessarily believe him, but I didn't really have a choice because it was the only option I had, and he was my only friend. I don't think I really saw it as a teacher probably in real time until I had gotten to the Middle East. This idea that reporters are unbiased is laughable because if you have a pulse, you have bias. So I was left living in my parents' guest bedroom with a backpack. That's all I had to my name. Born Lucky is that story of adapting me to the world rather than adapting the world to me.
First of all, this is my voice. I'm Tim Green, and I have ALS. But this podcast isn't about ALS. I don't want you to feel sorry for me. I don't feel sorry for me. I'm a father of 5, married for over 35 years, a New York Times best-selling author, an NFL first-round pick, and a practicing attorney. This is Nothing Left Unsaid, where my son Troy and I sit down with extraordinary people for raw, honest conversations about life, its toughest trials, and greatest triumphs. My voice in today's episode is powered by 11 Labs. Today's guest has chased truth through tear gas, crossed desert war zones, and into live studios where facts bend under pressure. Leland Vittert is a journalist who stood his ground in Baltimore, Cairo, and Capitol Hill. His memoir, Born Lucky, isn't just about surviving childhood autism or navigating the front lines of the news. It's a father-son story about grit, grace, and the kind of love that never makes the evening news, but changes everything. We're going to talk about resilience without bitterness, curiosity under fire, and the cost and the gift of telling the truth when it matters most. Leland, welcome to the show.
Pleasure and honor to be with you guys, both of you.
Looking back at the boy who cried himself to sleep and the man who stood in Tahrir Square, would that same boy believe where you are now?
Yes and no, Tim. Born Lucky is a book for every parent of a kid who is struggling. And my dad wrote the afterword to Born Lucky. And in the afterword, he says, tell your kid that they have the right stuff for life. And, when I was in 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, as you noted, crying myself to sleep, my dad's refrain to me over and over again always was, the qualities and characteristics of your character that are making you bullied now, that you're humiliated for, that you're beat up for, that you're isolated for, are going to make you successful later in life. Now, I didn't necessarily believe him, but I didn't really have a choice because it was the only option I had, and he was my only friend. What he didn't add was that middle school was probably the best training you could possibly get for a Washington newsroom or for the Middle East. So in that sense, it actually turned out to be remarkably sort of prescient and poignant to have gone through what I went through. But I think you rightly point out when you're going through it, it certainly doesn't seem like it's going to ever end.
This is not, the book's about a lot more than this, but this is something that we just brought up. I've been talking about a lot with people outside of the podcast. It's like, there's a kind of a debate going on in the country of like people homeschooling kids versus like private school and public school. And it seems like the two arguments are, one side is you shelter your kids, you protect them from the middle school bullies and chaos that you had to go through until they're comfortable enough with who they are. And then by the time they're that comfortable, the bullies don't matter. And the other side is you kind of, let them deal with that because it sucks, but everyone goes through it. And then later they'll be able to handle criticism or a Washington newsroom.
It's a great question, Troy. I think, I am not a parenting expert. This is a parenting book written by a kid. So I don't want to offer any advice. What I think is clear from the story from Born Lucky is that what has helped me the most was not my father removing adversity, right? Because when I was very young and diagnosed with what we now know to be autism, there was this push, and there's still a huge push for parents to bring in accommodations and to make life easy and to meet kids where they are and on and on and on. And it was exactly the opposite for me, right? It was, you can be more, and I'm going to hold your hand through the adversity, but we're going to go through the adversity. And, you think about that decision my dad made where I was 6 or 7 years old, and they said, hey, look, you need to have Lucky evaluated. That's what the teacher said to my parents. No parent wants to hear that about their child. They take me one of those medical testing centers with the, stale coffee and old magazines and linoleum floors and everything. They take me away for a couple of hours, and they come back and they say, he's got a lot of issues. He's got major behavioral issues. If somebody touches him in line, he turns around and slugs them. He cannot relate to kids his own age in any way. He's got major sensory issues. So if I had socks on I didn't like or anything like that, I would freak out and melt down, or a jacket. And I had major learning issues, which was, an IQ test that is 2 halves. IQ score is the average of those 2 halves. And my spread was 70 points between the 2 halves. A learning disability is 20 points. They'd never seen a spread that big. So the woman says to my parents, we really don't understand what's happening in his mind. So Born Lucky is that story of adapting me to the world rather than adapting the world to me.
He sounds like a truly amazing person. Leland, you didn't speak until age 3. Now millions listen when you talk. What does your voice really mean to you?
It's a great question. I think the one thing that is really stuck with me from my time in, grade school, middle school, high school, and how I was treated has been a really deeply held hatred of bullies, and a real feeling about the need for justice, and for standing up for what is right and for standing up for the people who can't stand up for themselves. And I think that takes many different forms, but I think that is something that's always appealed to me about journalism. And it's something that I've always felt was really important to do, to ask tough questions, even when they're not popular ones, which in our media environment today is something that is, I think, really lacking, is asking tough questions of both sides, which is what I think makes what I do different.
Born Lucky opens with a doctor calling you that after a near-death delivery. What made your parents turn that phrase into a compass?
I think it's kind of interesting because you're talking about the title of the book, Born Lucky, and it was because I was literally born, and the doctor goes, "This is the luckiest baby we've ever seen." My parents were in the delivery room. My mom was having a C-section, and the doctor goes, oh my God. And my dad's, my mom's hand just crunches down on my dad's hand, and they're going, what's wrong? And the doctor says, nothing, everything's fine. Everything, and it goes back and forth. And the doctor says, this is the luckiest baby we've ever seen. So it goes back and forth. And then outside of the hospital room where I was and my mom was, there's that little whiteboard, and it says, Carol Vittert, Leland Vittert, what time I last pooped, what time I last ate, whatever it was. And the doctor came up and crossed off Leland and said, call him Lucky. So that's where the nickname came from. And as I was thinking about writing this book, this is something we'd never talked about, right? This, my parents had never told anyone I was diagnosed, no teachers, no friends, no therapists, nobody. This was our struggle as a family. And my parents, called me Lucky until I was 18. I would introduce myself to people as Lucky Vittert. So as I would go through that, later in life, it occurred to me how much that applied later in life, how lucky I was to have my father, how lucky I was to have my sister, and my mom. And so it seemed like a pretty wonderful way to pay tribute to all of them, is that I was born lucky in so many different ways. Obviously, the first being lucky to be alive, because the umbilical cord was tied in a couple of knots and around my neck.
When you were growing up, did you literally think your name was Lucky, or you just liked the nickname?
I don't really remember when I realized my name wasn't legally Lucky, right? Because, and this is before Facebook or anything like this, but I mean, from when I was, knew my name, I was Lucky. And I think at some point my parents told me, oh, your name's Leland, but we call you Lucky. Everybody calls you Lucky. And then I don't remember how old I was, maybe 10 or 12 or something, that I started going by Leland. I started knowing that Leland was my real name. And when I got to college was when I made the switch. All through high school, I was Lucky. Everyone called me Lucky. I introduced myself. If I met you, Troy and Tim, I'd say, hey, Mr. Green, Lucky Vittert, nice to meet you. But when I went to college, it was just as Facebook was starting and email and everything else. So if your name is William, call me Bill, or Will, Timothy, call me Tim, whatever. That's really easy to explain. But if you're Leland, call me Lucky, everybody asks you to tell the story of why. And I didn't want to tell the story of my birth, 1,000 times to every kid I met at Northwestern. So I just started going by Leland.
So many people would have seen the diagnosis as a label. Your parents saw a challenge. What did it mean to grow up in a home where love was tough, strategic, and relentless?
I guess I don't know anything different. So it's hard to describe a contrast. What I think was most unbelievable about this story was what I learned about my dad as we went back and talked about this, because, I never went to therapy. He never went to therapy. We never did any of that. And we never really talked about this as a family. So when I went back and started asking my dad and my mom and my sister questions to write the book, the stories I heard from them were pretty extraordinary. That my dad every night would sit in my room upstairs with me, and for hours I would sort of take out on him the emotional abuse that I had been through throughout the day, of the isolation and the bullying and the difficulties. And sometimes it would be yelling, sometimes it would be crying, sometimes it would be a combination of the two, on and on and on. And I would then do my homework or go to sleep or whatever. He would walk downstairs from my bedroom down to the living room, where it was now 10, 11 o'clock at night. And he would sit there in the living room and start crying himself. And then my mom would come out and find him. So it was this very raw, minute-by-minute battle. And one of the things that we talk about in Born Lucky is the effect on my sister. My sister was 5 years younger than me. She was in kindergarten when I was in 5th grade. And I asked her, as we were interviewing her for the book, I said, what's your first memory of me? And she goes, oh, I can answer that. She said, I was in kindergarten, you were in 5th grade, and every day you'd come down from your 5th grade classroom to the kindergarten classroom and pick me up outside of kindergarten to walk home. And it was like a half a mile walk through the woods back to the house. And she said, every time, every day we got to the woods at the back of the PE fields at this school, you would start crying. And then I would grab your hand. And she's like, my first memories of my brother were crying because of the bullying and the difficulties of going through it, of what I was going through every day. So I think learning, to your point, Tim, about how the love was relentless and sort of all encompassing, but how much of it was an all of family affair, which I think you guys understand well.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. I've got like young kids, and like all you want to do once you have kids, and it sounds so corny, but you're just trying to protect them from like everything.
Right.
I can't imagine dealing with that as like your dad. I can't believe how the strength that must have taken, and not to like show up at the school. Like, I don't know. It's just that's so awesome.
You write that your dad didn't just love you, he trained you. What did those early drills like the watch tap or the push-ups teach you about discipline and self-awareness?
Yeah, I think This is all part of Dad's idea, right? That self-esteem is earned, not given, as a kid. And also the idea that every kid, every person can be more, right? There's not a lot of people with ALS with a podcast, and you're doing this and putting in the work and doing it with your son and your son supporting you because it is an opportunity to do more and to be more than and not let the diagnosis define you, which was sort of my dad's idea to me. He didn't put it in those words because I wasn't able to understand it. But, I'm 5 years old. He realizes I'm not going to be good at school. I'm not going to be good at athletics, and I'm not going to have friends, which are the three things that most kids get self-esteem from, right? And so his idea was, you know what? I am going to find ways that you can earn self-esteem. I can teach you discipline. I can teach you hard work. Number one was push-ups, 200 push-ups a day, 5 days a week for however many months. And then you got some kind of reward, like some kind of thing of, going to Disney World with your mom or something. That's number one. And then number two, you brought up the watch tap. This was much more about training me to understand the human equation and human condition, which I did not and was completely unaware of. So if we would go out to lunch with folks, or to dinner, or wherever I was really in interacting, and I was spending at this point, thousands of hours with my dad all the time because I had no friends. It wasn't like I went to, play dates or birthday parties or anything like that. So whenever he was with me and I was talking too much or was doing something sort of out of rhythm, if you want to call it that, sort of out of the normal social equation, he would tap his watch. And that was my message to A, stop talking, be quiet, kind of sit down and just sort of be quiet. But two, was a bookmark. And then later we would go back afterwards and we would post game it, right? We would start, okay, when Mr. Smith was talking about whatever, why did you interrupt and tell him about your push-ups? Well, what could you have asked Mr. Smith about what he was thinking about? How do you, and then we would role play out that new conversation to sort of teach me how to connect, or at least try to connect with somebody emotionally where they were at rather than where I was.
Man, it's like the level of love from your dad is so, and it's funny too that what I've noticed, and I don't want to give my dad a big head here, but like now that I'm older, right? Like you think about at the moment, your dad tapping his watch and you guys doing like watching film after a game. That's just what you did. It's just normal.
Yeah.
But thinking about now, like how much time your dad spent out of his life to do that stuff with you, to try and get you that to that point, that's amazing.
There's a moment in Born Lucky. I picked up golf late in life to be able to spend more time with Dad, and ended up really falling in love with it and really loving golf. So Dad and I are out on a golf course, and this goes back to what you were saying, Troy, about how much time and how much effort. Oftentimes if I was having a hard time at school or something happened when I was at school or whatever, it was before cell phones, but I would go to like the payphone and I would call my dad, and he would oftentimes be at a golf course, and I would say, okay, to the clubhouse, go find him, bring him, and I would, vent to him whatever was wrong, and then he would go finish his golf round. Happened all the time. So now fast forward, I was say 15, so fast forward 25 years or something, and we're out on a golf course, and I get a phone call from work about something happening, some schedule change, where it wasn't a big deal, but it was like frustrating. And it completely ruined my golf round. I was like having a great round. I'm on the 13th hole, and now doing my golf round is ruined. I'm so frustrated. And then it occurred to me, and I said, wait a second. I said, is this what it was like when I would call you on the 13th hole and you had to stop your golf round to come hear whatever had happened to me at school? And he goes, uh-huh. And he had never explained it to me about sort of and I said, and he goes, you have no idea how many rounds of my life got ruined on the 13th hole because of a phone call from you. And that moment perhaps encapsulated best what his sacrifice was, in that, he never complained. He never said, this is, a problem, or, this is, this is doing anything. He was just always there and always willing to take that emotional burden.
It's funny because I keep having those moments like it's like my kids are doing sports. And I remember there's this thing where we live called Bumblebee soccer. It's like little kids. And I remember when I was on the Bumblebee soccer team being like, man, I can really give my dad a run for his money now in soccer. Like I'm getting really good. My confidence is going through the roof. And then I got called him, I don't know, a month ago. And I'm like, when it first started, I'm like, dude, I still remember to this day that I was giving you a run for your money. I couldn't even like these kids are, they're 4 years old, 6 years old, whatever. They can barely move. They can't really dribble. I'm like, my memory still as a 31-year-old adult with kids. I'm like, yeah, when I was in Bumblebees, that's when I started really giving
really good. Yeah.
a first round NFL draft. Like I was giving a real run for his money.
I guess I'm a good actor. Leland, you've reported from war zones, bright lights, and political minefields. Which kind of chaos tested you the most, internal or external?
Great question. You inborn lucky, I tell the story of almost signing up for the CIA, which was a pretty fun 4 or 5 months to ride that pipeline. And I ultimately decided not to join the CIA. They liked me for a number of reasons. I think they liked me most when I told them the story of whether or not I had a felony or not. So the last step in the recruitment process before you sign up is you fill out what they call as an SF-86, which is basically a long form that says at the top, what you disclose here cannot be used against you. So the lifestyle poly wants to look through all of these issues that you have, sexual proclivities, drug use. Now they ask about online porn. There's all these different things they ask, financial issues, whether or not you can be blackmailed. The idea is if you disclose it, you can't be blackmailed for it. And one of the questions on the form was, have you ever committed a felony? I was like 22. And the answer was yes. So I clicked yes. And have you ever been convicted? No. And the guy who's my interviewer goes through the form and he's looking at it and he goes, you ever committed a felony? And I said, uh-huh. And he kind of looks at me and goes, you don't really look like that type. I said, well, I have. And he goes, okay, what was it? And I said, well, in college, I had an alcohol delivery business. So I had a great fake ID and a Costco card. And I would go to Costco and I would load up on alcohol and I would come back and I would resell it for a profit around the dorm and the fraternity house and everything else. And he says, okay. You ever get caught? And I said, well, no, actually. I said, I came close. I was at Costco one day with one of those big orange carts filled up with all the liquors, like a snowy, it was like January in Chicago. I go to school at Northwestern. I have a New Jersey fake ID. It had my real name on it, but a fake address. So I get to the register with, my cart full of liquor, my fake ID, and the woman's like ringing things up. And then an alarm goes off at the cash register, the lane I was in. And she goes, oh, we need a manager. And at this point, I'm thinking, okay, obviously she's figured out this is a fake ID. I should just run. But then if I run, it has my real name on it. They have my Costco card. I'll look guilty as hell. So the manager walks up and I said, I'm really sorry, but I'm in a little bit of a hurry. Is there a problem? And he says, oh, no problem. He says, you've just bought so much liquor at Costco over the past month. We need you to fill out an affidavit saying you're not going to wholesale it, which obviously what I was doing was wholesaling. But he says, why do you need all this liquor? And, pile of beer cases and, 6 packs of handles of cheap vodka and whatever, Smirnoff. And I said, oh, well, my buddies after college, we all have this big apartment. There's 5 of us who live in this apartment down in Wrigleyville. Just sort of making up the story as I went along. And we're having a big party this weekend. Okay, well, you need to come with me and we need to sign this affidavit. And I'm thinking, okay, obviously the cops are waiting in the back office, but if you run now, you're completely screwed. And, obviously they're going to come find you. I said, okay, so we go to the back office. There's no cops. And he starts filling out the affidavit and photocopying my Costco card and my ID and everything else and has me sign it. And just after I sign the affidavit, the manager looks at my ID. He goes, Mahwah, New Jersey. I'm from Mahwah, New Jersey. All the gin joints in all the world, this guy's from Mahwah. And so I'm telling the CIA officer this story, and he kind of looks at me and goes, what'd you do? I said, well, rule number one, when you're going to lie, keep it as short and as simple as humanly possible and give no more details than you absolutely have to. So I said, and the manager starts going through, like, oh, you're from Mahwah. Like, Mahwah, I went to Mahwah. Do you know this bar? Did you go to East High School or West High School? On and on and on. And I thought, how do I get out of this? I said, look, man, it was January. I said, I graduated from college about a year ago. My parents moved to Mahwah. I was home for the holidays and my driver's license was expired. So I just went to the New Jersey DMV to get this new driver's license. The only part about Mahwah, New Jersey I know is the Philadelphia airport. And the manager kind of looks at the Costco, looks at it, he goes, okay, hands it back to me. I walk out of Costco and the CIA guy goes, okay. He goes, I think we can live with that. But I had decided not to join the CIA because of the fear and difficulty I thought it would bring to my parents when I was away and not able to tell them what I could go do and on and on and on. We still call each other every night to say goodnight. So it tells you, if I'd gotten grabbed somewhere or something, what that would have done. So instead, I decided to do something safer and become a foreign correspondent. Is a very long way, Tim, to answer your question. Being a foreign correspondent, I think, tested me more, certainly in terms of physical courage, because of times that it was pretty scary. I think tested me more mentally because it was something I had never done before, and in the learning curve of learning to report while under fire, while taking care of a small team, while being sent overseas with absolutely no training. CIA gives you 2 years of training. Fox News gave you $50,000 in a backpack and said, good luck. It's not quite fair, but it's pretty close. So I think that the 2020 election, I think, is what tested me the most in terms of personal, sort of my personal courage, I think, in a way. And it was interesting, right? Because at the end of the 2020 election, I find myself in my parents' house in Florida. I'd been asked to leave Fox News. I had almost died of COVID. And I had had gone through a really terrible breakup with a girlfriend that I'd been dating. So I was left living in my parents' guest bedroom with a backpack. That's all I had to my name. And my dad said to me when I was feeling particularly sorry for myself one day, he said, Lucky, he said, you got up every day and went back to middle school. And he said, that means you can get through this. So that was, I think, the kind of the full circle of why getting through those really hard times in middle school was so important.
Was it just the asking the question that, is that for Fox when they got rid of you? Was it just asking the question, or was it more than that?
To be fair, and for those who are interested in the inner workings of cable news, Born Lucky sort of takes you through the internal politics that were happening at the network at the time. I was being phased out, sidelined, whatever you want to call it. My brand of journalism was not really appreciated by Fox. And the executives made that known. So I think you don't want to say it, you want to use the cliche, it was the straw that broke the camel's back, but it was certainly, I think it was happening that I was being phased out. This accelerated that greatly. And then because of it, I was sort of punished, which I don't think, which obviously was quite personal.
The phrase you use, adversity is your friend, isn't something people say unless they've earned it. Where did you first learn to see pain as a teacher?
I don't think I really saw it as a teacher probably in real time until I had gotten to the Middle East. I think that's sort of the point in my career where I could look back and see all of those lessons coming back, and understanding how having gone through what I went through had made me so much stronger. So I think that probably is the tipping point. And there's in Born Lucky, there's the letter that my dad wrote me before I left to go to the Middle East. He handed it to me at the airport, to say, here you go. Sort of I don't call it a goodbye letter, whatever you want to call it, but it was and I carried it with me throughout my whole time in the Middle East. But I think that probably was the tipping point.
And your dad, like when you're going through all this stuff when you're younger, the push-ups, the watch taps, the bullying, all that stuff, did it feel like it was getting easier? Like, I don't know. I know autism is it's a very personal thing, and I hope this isn't an offensive question, but like for my brain, like for everyone, most kids who aren't going through, aren't dealing with autism, it's like you start to get kind of numb to it, or maybe you don't. Maybe everyone handles it different ways. But did it ever get easier, or was every day kind of like that?
It came and went. The thing I say about Born Lucky is it's not a prescription, it's not a cure, it's my story, right? And I think it's what makes it a story for parents of a kid having a hard time with autism or ADHD or anxiety or physical disabilities or bullying or whatever a kid's having a hard time with. The lessons of Born Lucky apply. And I think it gives parents real hope that they can make an enormous difference. But I think if you ask my dad, he would tell me, and I would agree with this, that, while you were in it, while you were walking through hell, you didn't really realize that it was getting better. I think the only thing that my dad realized is we're one step closer to him graduating high school, right? It was like just this, it was an everyday. And even after that, there were some real challenges as well. So I think that arc, that certainly continued. The best times were in the summer because I didn't have to go to school. So it was a very long struggle. And I think my dad would tell you is that in it was very difficult to see that anything was getting better.
It's hard to see progress in any challenging moment while you're still going through it. So you weren't told about your autism diagnosis until college. When you finally had a name for what made life so hard, what changed inside you?
It's a really good question. And I think not much. I always sort of knew that I was me, and I knew that I really had to learn the social skills and the emotional connection that came so easy to other people. And it's still a learned discipline. In Born Lucky, I'm a freshman in college, and I have tried to rush, the fraternities, and the last fraternity of all the ones that I had tried to join pulled me upstairs and said, we're not interested in you. So I go down to the street at Northwestern by the fraternity quad, and in the middle of a snowstorm, I'm calling my dad saying, Dad, nobody wants me. Which the irony, if you read the book, or when you read the book, is that he had gone through a very similar experience. And, it was the first time I said to my dad, I'm just like you. We went through this thing together when he was in college. But I think the takeaway from it, which was hard, is I'm trying to think about the right way to say this. It was the first time, and I said this to my dad, that maybe this is me. And I think that was the first time it was both a realization, and I was mature enough to understand that all these things my dad were teaching me, it was sort of like they had consequences and they had effects, and I had to now learn how to adapt. And it's still a struggle every day. I don't ever say to people, hey, I'm Leland Vittert and I have autism. I guess now obviously everybody knows it. Going to therapy on national television is an experience. I don't suggest it. But every day there's moments that I sort of have to mentally discipline myself and say, better. And I'll give you just an example. When it failed about 4 or 5 weeks ago, I was playing golf with my father-in-law, whom I'm very close with, wonderful man. And we're playing golf with this other older gentleman. He's probably 80, 75. Great golfer, nice guy. We're having this wonderful round. And at the end of the round, I'm running late, and I'm trying to pack my clubs into the travel bag for my golf travel bag. And one classic symptom of autism is you become very task-focused and very task-oriented. And so I'm trying to pack the golf clubs and pack the golf bag. And the older man who we played golf with came over to try to talk to me. And he's standing above me, like trying to look down and talk to me. And I'm just cold ignoring him, just totally ignoring him, packing the travel bag. And there was a voice in my head that said, God blessed Lucky, you have to stop and talk to this man. And you're being rude, and you need to stop. And the 2 minutes it's going to take to talk is not going to make you so late, and on and on and on. But I literally could not help myself. I couldn't help myself. And it was really rude. And the guy finally walked away and left, as he well should have, because of how rude I was being. And I later wrote him a note, text, and said, after I found his phone number, I said, I'm really sorry. I'm terribly upset about how rude I was. And it was totally wrong of me. And I apologize. I know better. I didn't follow it up with, oh, by the way, I have autism, or that was the autism, or that's something I'm working on, or something like that. Because I think the reason my dad didn't ever tell me is number one, he didn't want me to be defined by the diagnosis, but he never wanted me to use it as an excuse either.
Mm-hmm. And did you, when you found out or when you were told, did it kind of like click? Did things all of a sudden make more sense or no?
Yeah, look, it was an arc, right? Of saying, you were diagnosed with it and blah, 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 blah. And then sort of slowly backing into, what does that mean? And on and on and on. At the time when I was told, I was sort of old enough and developed enough socially and emotionally to kind of say, well, that makes sense. Like, I get it. But I've never, maybe it's just because of how my dad taught me about my own, sort of about taking responsibility. I've never sat there and read well, what parts of me are because I'm autistic, and what does it mean? And I haven't really spent a lot of time thinking about what it means or anything, because to me, kind of the standard's always been the standard, and that's what I hold myself to, and that's what I do.
You once said your father feared you wouldn't survive the newsroom. What's the moment you knew you had?
Well, I think you could argue that I haven't. Sometimes I still have those fears, and Washington newsrooms are still pretty brutal places. I think by the time I got to Denver, I understood how to operate in a newsroom. And one thing about newsrooms is everybody loves success. So sort of the bigger deal you are inside of newsroom, the more protected you are, to a certain extent. Which I guess now that I do what I do, that offers a certain amount of protection that just people aren't going to be as mean to you, although they will be behind your back. So I don't think there was a time that I knew I was going to survive, that I knew that was the moment. But certainly a lot of the issues that I had growing up have been in newsrooms, and I write in Born Lucky about, a colleague in Denver that was really brutal. I mean, would, sort of over and over again set me up to fail. I don't want to be too identifying in what happened, but it was awful over time. And that happened, that happened in Orlando. It happened in Denver. So it's always been sort of still a struggle with a certain group of people.
Is the setup for failure, you think, just because that in that profession, it's like only one person can be the main guy? Or?
Yeah, it is cable news, local news is about as cutthroat of an industry as you can possibly be in, because I think, Troy, as you pointed out, there are more NFL starting quarterbacks than there are primetime cable TV anchors. So it's changed a little bit because of YouTube and that kind of stuff, but those jobs are so highly coveted that people, and there's so much money involved, at least there used to be a lot more money involved too, that people will sort of do anything and fight as unfairly as they possibly can, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. And you mentioned like obviously issues socially, and then you're saying CIA, which I guess to me, I'm thinking it kind of makes some sense, right? If you're a smart guy, but don't want to interact with certain people, or how to almost have trained yourself, or you and your dad have kind of trained you to think differently. But how the heck do you end up in a newsroom?
Yeah, it's a great question. How do you go from obviously having a hard time emotionally connecting with people and talking with people and on to a profession that requires you to emotionally connect and talk is probably the number one and number two requirements. I basically ended up in journalism by accident. In Born Lucky, it was sort of, we talk about the necessity of setting goals. And I was in St. Louis for a summer to row and to hang out with my girlfriend. My parents were out of town for the summer. And my dad said, you need a job. And the first job that anyone had offered me was a summer internship at a radio station. So I took it, and my dad kept pressuring me, okay, you're good at this. And TV, especially actual journalism, meaning like just, writing stories, being a reporter, sort of an old-fashioned reporter, really yields itself to hard work. You know, it's one of those things that doesn't require as much skill as it does just require hours and just working like hell. And that sort of my work ethic yielded results, so I just kind of kept growing in it. If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Leland, you were attacked outside the White House while covering the George Floyd protests. What did that moment teach you? Not about politics, but about people.
Wow. That's a great question. We were outside the White House for the George Floyd riots, protests, whatever you want to call them. And we could tell the crowd was getting pretty rowdy. We were on the protester side. So the Secret Service had a barricade line. They obviously had the White House fence, but it was before the riots had gotten really violent enough. The riots were getting worse. And at the same time, I think the Secret Service was a little bit behind understanding how bad it was going to get that night. And there was this guy in a hoodie. I remember this thin white guy in a hoodie, and he kept following us around, asking you who you were with, who are you with, who are you with, who are you with? And you learned to never say you were with Fox News, just because it caused problems. Unless you were at a hurricane in the South, then they loved you. But if you were if you were in certain neighborhoods or around certain groups, you generally didn't say. So we're a freelance crew. We work for an international news organization, on. And we kept sort of trying to move away from him, and he kept following us. And then I could see him point out to some people who I was. They had found me on social media and said, that's him. And it's funny, you see me on the air in this, what we call a triple box. So kind of like how we're talking now, like three of us sitting there, and the anchor was starting to read my intro, and I'm going like this, like, don't come to me, don't come to me. And the producer keeps yelling in my ear, stop shaking your head, stop shaking your head. You're on TV, you're on TV. And I'm like, don't come to us. And as soon as I started talking, this group from Antifa jumped us. I never thought something like that would happen in America. Shows you what I know. I think what I learned in that was just how quickly the world can get out of control. And I'd seen it happen overseas. It happened faster here, that the speed at which sort of the mob took over. And we were lucky to get out. We got thumped pretty good and then made our way to a police car, and finally the riot team arrived and helped us. But it was really a pretty dicey few, 20 minutes or something, whatever it was caught on tape. I think it also, it made me really sad, I think, to understand how, and this has only gotten worse, obviously, over the past 6 years or whatever it is, that America really isn't, there's a large part of America, and I think this is a problem on both sides, it has no interest in understanding that the truth's probably somewhere in the middle, and we all need to get along, and that's sort of the story of America, and that's what's made America great. That there's a large group of people, and it's because there's big incentives for both sides to amplify the extremes and to excuse the extremes. I think it's just a sad realization.
Yeah, you mentioned too earlier about like your style of reporting, like asking the questions that people don't want to answer, and I think that now too is almost more. It's like everybody's walking on eggshells, because you can't really defend, in my opinion. It's hard to defend either party, because like the extremists on both sides are kind of more calling the shots than the 80-90% of people who are just kind of slight right or slight left. And it's really hard to defend the kind of the crazy side of both parties.
Sure, which is why politicians don't like going for either side, but I think it's more so on the Democratic side, don't like going to places where they're going to be asked tough questions.
Right.
And it's kind of the brand of journalism I've always done, is ask both sides tough questions. And I think it's really important to give the center of America, which, as you point out, is sort of the majority of Americans are between the 35-yard lines. American politics really are a bell-shaped curve, right? The vast majority is in between the first two or three standard deviations, and when you get out to the tails, it's much thinner. I think that those people in the middle deserve a voice, right? They deserve a voice, and they also realize, I think our viewers, at least at News Nation, I think, I don't want to speak for anybody else, but I think my viewers are smart. They're not smart just because they watch me. They're smart because they want to be challenged, and they realize that watching news is not just about having your opinions reaffirmed every night. It's about learning about things that may or may not reaffirm your opinion and being willing to change your opinion and hearing things that may be uncomfortable to you.
I think I agree with everything you just said. And most people I know, maybe it's an age thing, or maybe it's just the bubble that I'm in. Most people don't even, including myself, I don't even really watch the news anymore, because it's just echo. You can get in one echo chamber or the other, and either one's going to frustrate the heck out of you because it's not, I don't know, not real, or whatever you want to say.
Yeah.
But when I'm trying to think, if I was in your shoes, like if somebody attacked me at the George Floyd, at that whole thing, like how did you not? Did you? I feel like it could push somebody to be an extremist yourself, being like, you know what, this stuff is, you know what I mean?
I guess. I mean, that means I've been chased out of Tahrir Square by people, chanting Fox News hates Muslims and tried to be attacked and everything else. I think the flip side of it is you become really based in realism. I don't look at my job as a journalist to be an advocate. And by that, I mean, I think that and people always say, how can you deal with all the anger and all and I always think to myself, like, I don't take it personally. Like, my job is to call the game. And if you think about like watching a TV broadcast, I'm not a huge sports person, but so the analogy I'm sure breaks down. But if you watch or listen to the radio broadcast of the New York Yankees playing the Boston Red Sox, if you listen to the Boston announcer calling the game for Boston radio, it's going to sound very different than the New York guy calling the game for New York radio. But then if you listen to just the national broadcast, you pretty much just, people used to always say to Al Michaels, I know you're rooting for the Steelers, or I know you're rooting for the Patriots in some Super Bowl. And he goes, I'm not rooting for anybody. I'm rooting for drama. I'm rooting for ratings. That's, now I can't use that line anymore because drama in politics now has other meanings. It used to not, say 10 years ago. So you could kind of use that joke, but that's the way I look at it.
And then media, like, I'm not nearly as well versed on the topic or subject as you, but it seems like media now has been almost like maybe the number one contributor to the divisiveness, maybe social media, but the news media on top of it seems like a lot of times amplifies it. Do you agree with that? Do you disagree with that?
Well, Troy, number one rule: journalists make lousy media critics. So that's not my role. We could do a whole podcast on why things have gotten more segmented or fragmented, or the extremes have been amplified. But basically, right, you started it, 20 or 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you had one broadsheet newspaper and three broadcasters in every, in America, NBC, ABC, and CBS. That was it. So in order to get viewers or readers, they had to broadcast. They had to, broadcast to the broadest possible audience. Same with the newspaper. Now, you go through cable news, then the advent of social media, and now where everybody has a podcast and a YouTube stream, now you can narrowcast, and the algorithm will deliver you this very, very, very hyper-focused set of content that amplifies your own opinions, right? So is that really journalists' fault? I don't quite see it that way. I think it basically is the reason we're so divided is because it makes money, whether that be with, YouTubers or tweeters, or more importantly, I think the reason that our politicians are so divided is because they're driven by fundraising dollars. And, saying the most outrageous thing gets them more clicks, more fundraising, more support from the base. So that to me is where the real drive comes from.
Do you think that your style of media, like your style of interviewing, do you think that can help? Like, in my opinion, I think if you ask both sides the hard questions, maybe it just pisses everybody off, or maybe it brings people back more towards the center. Because I think if you believe, like, I don't know, I guess I want you to use names, but there's plenty to pick from, like a crazy politicians on the left or on the right. And if you hear, like, I don't know, maybe like breaks people out of their trance and like, wow, this is nuts.
Yeah, I think it's more what I'll say, and why I am so happy to be doing what I'm doing and working where I work at News Nation, is that in order to be in the center, you have to accept that your opinions may not always be right, or that two things can be true at once. And I think we're in this very unique position in America right now where people don't want to believe two things can be true. They only want to believe what they believe, and the rest of the world doesn't exist. And, I'll give you an example. And I don't know when this is going to air, but when there was the No Kings rally, right? The 7 million people who came out on Saturday to protest Trump. Well, there's going to be a certain part of the media, okay, that's going to only cover the loons who are out there, right? And there were a lot of them. There was the teacher who was making the thing like this about, Charlie Kirk deserved to get shot. There is the piñatas of Donald Trump that people are beating on. There's the people in Chicago who are calling for the rest of the rally goers to take up arms against ICE. The list goes on and on of really awful things that were said and done at these rallies, that if Republicans were doing them, liberals would be totally outraged. But liberals aren't going to cover that at all. All you're going to hear about is how this was 7 million people who came out in defense of democracy, okay, and that Trump's a king. Well, Trump's not a king. No, I don't know any kings that allow 7 million people to protest peacefully and then go home and still have all the rights they had the day before. That's just not how kings are, whatever. ... The right in America will only cover the loons and laugh at all these people and say, oh, well, they're just a bunch of, liberals who've lost their minds. Well, I think there's probably a lot of things can be true at once, that you've got this very dangerous part of the left of America that now is condoning violence and are certainly becoming violent adjacent, as they are Hamas adjacent. And then you've got a lot, a good, 7 million people in America who came out on their Saturday to protest against Donald Trump. And I'm old enough to remember, I love saying that, when I covered this thing called the Tea Party in 2009 and 2010, which were a bunch of loons, I shouldn't say a bunch, some loons on the right who were talking had this very violent and overheated rhetoric. But then there were millions of people who were really angry about what they saw as government overreach and the culture war and on and on. Well, what came out of the Tea Party 6 years later but Donald Trump? So I think the right is wrong to dismiss it as a bunch of loons, and I think the left is wrong to say all that matters is there's people who came out against Donald Trump. And as a journalist, my job is to cover that whole thing fairly.
Yeah, it's hard to find the middle, even like
does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think it does, and it's there's no way there's 7 million crazy people, right? But there's no way there were not 7 million saints out there either, right? So it's like, but to your point, I don't even know, like it's hard to as a consumer. I got so fed up of trying to find the middle that I pretty much stopped. But it's like, where do you even go for
9 p.m. Eastern on News Nation?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And now I know I'm gonna tune in and try it, but it's like it's so hard to.
Yeah, it is.
Many reporters talk about the power of neutrality. You talk about the cost of integrity. When did you first feel, I'm not just recording, I'm holding the line?
I'm going to answer that in a different way, I think, because of my experience, which is this idea that reporters are unbiased is laughable, because if you have a pulse, you have bias. And then, they said, oh, we'll try to do this with AI. And we ended up with black Nazis. So wild bias. Bias to me is not having an opinion. It's excluding an opinion. And it's not being honest about what your opinion is. And the idea that all these journalists will, oh, I'm unbiased, I don't have an opinion. Of course you have an opinion. We see it. It's obvious what your opinion and what your bias is. So be honest about it and be willing to hear out the other side and ask both sides the hard questions. And I think that to me is the harder intellectual thing to do, right? Like, I worked at Fox News. I know their playbook very well. I know how to sort of peddle in daily outrage or hourly outrage. What's harder to me is to look at a situation and say, okay, what really are the both sides of this situation, and how do I give a hard time to both sides, and do so fairly and evenly. And I think it's always funny to watch, because there was an interview that I did with the Speaker of the House about 10 days ago, maybe 12 days ago, and it was a good interview. It was a tough interview. It was a fair interview. He ended it, and he and I know each other well, shook hands, and he said, all right, but that's played on a loop on CNN and MSNBC over the past couple of weeks, because of how I pushed him on a couple of things. And CNN and MSNBC were very happy about that. Fine. And then there's been times that I've pushed Democrats on things, and Fox News has played it on a loop over and over and over again. And to me, that's sort of the mark of really good journalism, is when other networks are picking up your clips sort of equally of you questioning both sides and saying, see, this proves our point.
I think too, are you sacrificing growth? Are you sacrificing viewership by playing the middle, do you think?
No. Troy, I can't speak for anybody else. I speak for me, but I think that the reason we are growing, the reason we're the fastest growing network on cable, not just cable news, is because we're in the middle, because nobody else is doing it. And there's a lot of people like yourself who want someone questioning both sides. You sort of hear parts of both sides' message and say they agree with it, and hear with both sides' message they disagree with it, and want somebody advocating, if you will, for them and doing old-fashioned journalism. That to me is why we're growing. We're not sacrificing it.
You've said your rule is simple: do the right thing, and if there are consequences, be damned. When was that principle hardest to live by?
Boy, I think obviously, getting invited not to return to Fox News was quite hard. Certainly, sort of the most costly publicly. There was an incident in high school, which I write about in Born Lucky, about there was a young woman who I knew, who I guess I wasn't friends with, but was friendly with, and I had just lost a friend or a rowing teammate to suicide. And we had just had a big assembly at school that said, if you hear something, if somebody tells you they're going to hurt themselves, you must bring it up. You have to talk about it. And this young girl and I shouldn't say young girl, we were both, I think, juniors in high school. We're on AOL Instant Messenger back in the day. For Troy, if you don't remember AOL Instant Messenger, and she said she was going to kill herself, and I kept, sort of messaging her back, and I kept calling her, and on and on and on. She didn't pick up the phone. I tried to call her parents. They didn't answer. I called her home phone. Her father was a doctor, so I tried to page him. and tried to get a hold of him. And finally, I ended up printing out the transcript of the messages and took them over to the headmaster of the school. I went to a private high school and handed it to him and said, all right, now you deal with this. So they called her parents, and evidently she and her family got very upset that I did this because they thought it was going to ruin her chance of getting into college and this was going to be so terrible. And then her boyfriend at the time was a very popular kid in school. He was a football player and sort of one of the big guys on campus. And they ostracized me from the entire school. The word went out, no one at school will speak to Leland, or to Lucky at the time. And nobody did for months. So I think probably in terms of, just sort of my world at the time, that was kind of the biggest sort of sacrifice for doing the right thing. In neither situation did I have any idea what the cost would be for doing that.
You covered the fall of Gaddafi, the chaos in Gaza, Ukraine's front line. But have you ever had a moment in the middle of war that gave you hope?
Well, I had a moment that I thought would give me hope. And that was when I went to go interview a failed suicide bomber in Gaza. This story's gotten a lot of pickup lately because, when I went to the Middle East, I kind of had this very conventional wisdom Pollyanna view that, it's a both sides issue and Israel needs to do more to protect the Palestinians, and really Palestinians all just want to live in peace, and, on and on and on. Much of the sort of conventional wisdom that we're hearing now that Israel's the problem. So I'd been there for about 2 years, and there was a trade, much like the one that just happened with Gaza, for one Israeli soldier who had been kidnapped, a guy named Gilad Shalit, for 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. And one of the prisoners who was released back to Gaza was a woman named Wafa. The other one was Yahya Sinwar, the guy who planned October 7th. But for this story, the most important person is Wafa. And Wafa was a woman in Gaza, I think she was in her teenage years, when she was burned in a cooking accident. This is during the Second Intifada, but still, Israel let her come to Israel and receive medical care. So she received first-class medical care for her burns. She would have died had she stayed in Gaza because they spend more money on terrorism than they do on hospitals. And she got sort of better with her burns, and started then going back from the hospital to Gaza. So she had a pass that could get her from Gaza into Israel, which was very unusual. So during the Second Intifada, Hamas, or the Alaska Martyr Brigade at the time, recruited her as a suicide bomber because she could get into Israel. So she is given 3 targets to choose from. She's given the target of a bus, a cafe, or the hospital that treated her. She chose the hospital that treated her, that she wanted to go blow herself up at and kill everybody there. So she gets to the checkpoint with Gaza, between Gaza and Israel, and they think that she has a bomb. She tries to detonate the bomb. It doesn't go off. And she gets arrested by the Israelis. Once again, they treat her. They, give her all this medical attention. They educate her. They give her a college degree, on and on and on. She's now in an Israeli prison. 2012 or 2011, she gets traded back to Israel. So she's traded back to Gaza from Israel. So I wanted to go interview her it was like November, December of 2011, to try and sort of show that there is hope, there is redemption. This is going to be a peace story. I was going to interview her, and she was going to talk about how, she really believed now in trying to bring both sides together, and she was so happy to be alive. So I get into Gaza, and I have with me an iPad that has the video of her trying to blow herself up. So I'm showing her the video of her trying to blow herself up. And she gets this huge smile on her face as I'm showing her the video of her trying to blow herself up. And I think to myself, like, excuse me? Like, what are you thinking right now? And she goes, oh, that's the moment I almost tasted paradise. Okay. Would you do it again? And she goes, oh, absolutely. This is my calling, to be a suicide bomber, because the Israelis are infidels, and I will try to kill them until my last day. And that's kind of when I don't want to put too much of a downer on this, Tim, but that's when I gave up hope in a lot of these situations.
You don't want to be too much of a downer, but holy crap, that's a downer.
Well, I think you know,
Truth, though.
the hard part of it is it's real, and it's what we don't see in America. You know, it's the part of this story that we kind of all gloss over, but that is the reality in war. The war is awful, and that's kind of what we're dealing with in the Middle East.
Ah, that's so sad to hear. Bringing it back to you for a minute, I wanted to ask you a personal question, if you don't mind. Most people didn't know you were autistic until this book. Is there something you want people to better understand about what autism looks like in real life?
That's a great question. And I am not an expert on autism. You know, one of the big autism groups, I think it's the Society or Autism Speaks or one of those, says, when you've met a kid with autism, you've met one kid with autism. So it's not, and I don't profess to be an expert in it. And certainly because of sort of the path my parents chose, I didn't get therapy or any of the sort of usual things that people deal with autism. The one thing I want people to take away from the story is hope. And I think, you know, you guys understand that better than most do. The genesis of the book was to give families the hope that my parents didn't have. And by that, I mean that, you know, these are the most intimate, difficult, horrible stories of my growing up in my childhood. You know, the principals who, you know, called my parents in after being in 7th grade for 2 weeks and said to my parents in that principal's, you know, room, you know, Lucky, everybody at this school thinks Lucky's quite weird. And frankly, we do too, or I do too. That's the principal. So, I mean, there's all these moments. But when I wrote the book, I was interviewing Dad for writing it. And in every story, he would say, well, do we really want to tell that? Do you really want to get that emotional? Do you really want to say all that, you know, on and on and on? And I got to thinking about it. And every time we would get to a story, he'd say, well, you know, that's so personal. Do we really want to tell it? And I finally decided, I was like, look, Dad, I can't adjudicate each one of these stories. Like, I can't every time decide, stop writing or stop interviewing you and like go through, do we really want to tell the story? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the book with everything in it. And you're going to be as raw as you can be. And at the end, if you don't like the manuscript, I won't turn it into HarperCollins. Which, to be fair, I didn't have a plan if he said no, because I had a book deal, but then I wouldn't have had a manuscript. So I give him the manuscript at the end, and he says, let me read it. And he reads it, and he goes, I don't know about this. I really don't. You know, do we really want to do this? And I said, let me turn it around for you. If back when I was 5 or 6 years old, when I was diagnosed, that woman who said, we don't understand what's going on inside his head, you got to meet him where he's at, there's not much you can do, instead handed you Born Lucky, how would you have felt? And he said, I would have read it every day. So to me, that's really the takeaway from this book, of this idea for parents about the power that they have, the hope that exists, the agency that they have to really make this enormous difference in their kids' lives.
Well, Born Lucky isn't just your story, it's your father's story too. What do you think your father saw in you that others didn't?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that he cared, and that he wanted to make a difference, and that he knew that the only chance I would have was to adapt to the world. So I think there was a big part of that was him sort of trying to do anything, you know, he could do. He said to the woman who diagnosed me, is there anything we can do? Anything. So I think, you know, he saw his son, and he saw his son that he knew in order to have a more productive life was going to have to really change. So that to me is sort of the genesis of his efforts. He said, I didn't know if it was going to work, but I had to give you a chance.
I know you're not, and you're saying it intentionally. You're not the expert on it. You're not the parenting expert. You're not the autism expert. But if you had a son that was going through similar challenges that you were going, would you follow your dad's playbook, or would you have done things differently?
I don't know. I think now, Troy, we know so much more. We have so much more information, but at the same time, there's this sort of desire to, meet every kid where they're at, and sort of, as we talked about before, put everybody in bubble wrap and just sort of let them be. So I don't know. I mean, I'll go both ways. I guess probably the answer to that is I don't know. The guiding principle to me is what Dad wrote in the afterword, which I think you'll appreciate as a dad. And it really is just about the power of digging in for your kid, whatever that means, right? It's I don't know if I would do things differently. I don't know what the situation would be. I don't know if I would be able to quit my job to be able to spend, all my time with my son. There's all these different things, but the one thing I took away from Dad is I asked him, well, what if you couldn't have quit your job, and left your companies and taken a step back? And he said, well, I would have worked the night shift because I knew the only chance you had was for me to be there when you got up and went to school, when you got home from school. So that to me is that kind of North Star of what matters.
That's a true dad right there. Leland, you've had cameras in your face, critics at your back, and protesters in your space. But what's the quietest battle you've ever fought?
I think probably obviously this one, right? Because I never talked about it for 40 years. So I think it's been this battle. And now I'm talking about it not because it's a lot of fun, but because I think that it can make a real difference for parents to understand how big of a difference they can make.
Let's talk about faith, not as dogma, but as a source of strength. Where has your faith been most tested? And how did that test shape the way you love your family? I don't ask from a place of judgment. I was an undercover Christian until I finally looked my ALS diagnosis in the eyes and decided it was time to step up.
It's an interesting question. I think, the truism that there's no atheists on a battlefield or no atheists in a foxhole is definitely true, right? And I've been born lucky. On my last day in Jerusalem before I left to go to the airport, I went to the Western Wall, which is where Jews go and leave notes, normally asking God for something. And I just pulled a note card out of my wallet I just keep a stack of note cards in my wallet. And I just wrote, thank you for keeping me safe. So I think that, there were those moments that really tested me. Certainly being under fire. To me, I've always just been so grateful that I've had the family that I've had, and that I've had the love and support that they brought. You'll find when you read Born Lucky that you could very easily see my dad's sort of teaching and love and philosophy about the world coming from some sort of deep kind of faith kind of issues. So that would be my, I hope that answers the question. How about that?
Beautifully said, Leland. Now, you've talked about balance on air, but what grounds you when the world feels anything but balance?
Well, my wife has a lot to do with that. And it's been, the great part of my move to News Nation and move to Chicago and everything else was meeting Rachel. So that's been an enormous source of strength and grounding. And I think also being grounded in the values that my dad taught me, of doing the right thing, of telling the truth, of hard work. These are like very basic things that you can do no matter what. My dad always taught me, you can control two things. You can control your character and you can control your work ethic. That no one can take either of those two things away from you ever, no matter what is whatever you're facing. And you'd probably add to that your attitude. And the one thing that he was resolute about throughout my whole life was you're not a victim and you can't act like a victim. I could do a lot of things. But sort of victimhood he viewed, and I think rightly so, as this drug that is completely destructive and addictive, which he just did not allow me to partake in.
When you first think about that, someone growing up with autism and taking that stance to parents, it seems like intense, but it's you wouldn't let your son do it if he didn't have autism. So why would you let your son do it if he does, right? And it's like,
Right.
it's holding that standard, I think, is, and kind of protecting that standard is really like what your dad did. He held you, and I don't know anything about your sister, but I'm sure he held you guys to the similar standard regardless of.
Oh, she got it much easier than me. Come on.
If a young person out there is being called weird or too much or not enough, what's the page or moment in Born Lucky you hope they cling to?
Well, number one, the idea that it gets better. High school is not real life. I always say I never liked anyone who liked high school, because the values that make you popular in high school are not the ones that make you a good person. I also say I never like anybody who likes Washington, because the values in Washington are equally screwed up to high school. So there's that, number one. I think number two, what I would say is, fight like hell, which I did, to not change yourself, not change your values. But there is this idea right now of everyone should just accept everyone for who they are and celebrate all the differences, and on and on and on. And that may work for some people. That is not what I was sort of taught. And by that, I mean, my parents were very clear. There are parts of you that are absolutely wonderful. There are parts of you that are really incredible. Your character is going to define you, all these things. But there is these parts of your personality that you have to understand the world sees as off-putting, as difficult, as weird, whatever it may be, whatever the adjective you want to use is. And we need to work on adapting those. We need to work on changing those. And that was a very clear and important message over and over and over and over again from my parents. And I would just to follow that up, I wouldn't say to a kid, hey, you do you, buddy, no matter how, who you are. There's parts of the human equation and the social fabric of things that really help you enormously if you can understand, relate to, deal with.
You said at college, when you first tried to, get into the fraternities and stuff, they kind of rejected you. But college also seems like a place where, I was saying to my younger brother, just went to college, and I said, the cool thing about college is everybody's weird, and you finally can all admit it. And no matter what your weird hobby is or interest, there's other people at your college that are going to have, whether it's a small college, there's still going to be at least one other kid on that campus that likes the same kind of weird things you do. Did you fit in socially in college?
I did not. I guess I did more, but still my you call it weird, call it whatever you want to, Troy, but my ability to interact with people and to interact in the normal sort of interaction of human dynamics didn't really exist. So, in college, there were a couple of guys who were nice to me, but it was because they were meeting me where I was at, right? They were sort of seeing past the awkward comments and the weird intensity and the off-rhythm nature of how I dealt with people socially, because they kind of liked who I was and the values I had, right? Versus, I think versus as I got older, those friendships more became because I really, starting in college and then after, really worked enormously hard at modifying, whatever you want to call it, my behavior to that social emotional fabric that is the human dynamic.
Is it easier today than it was when you were in college?
It's a good question. And yeah, I mean, it's a lot easier, but as I told you earlier, it is a daily discipline. It's an hourly discipline to look people in the eye, to really listen and internalize what they're saying and meet them emotionally where they are and have that give and take. And the more stressed I get or the more tired I get or whatever, it becomes even more requiring of sort of that deep, and I hate this word, but that intentionality of really doing it.
Before we close, brag about your family for a minute. What did your dad never get credit for? And what's one thing you hope your future kids know about their father when they read this book?
Oh, I love that question. I think that's the nothing left unsaid part, right? Of this. I think that's why I wrote the book. And one of the reasons I really wanted to write it now, my dad's 78, 79, was so that we got his perspective and we really got the benefit of his memories of all these times, but also so that we got that he got to hear really how I felt and how I understood the sacrifices and I understood what it meant. And that really sort of led into the timing here of this. I said to him, this is really a love letter, a thank you letter to him, which is actually, weirdly enough, how the whole thing started.
Now on to our final word segment, where we ask our guests a few rapid fire questions. What was the happiest moment in your life?
Getting married.
What is the biggest adversity you've faced?
We've spent 2 hours talking about it.
What are you most excited about?
Well, on the family side, married and, starting that and seeing what that means for our life and whether we're blessed with children or not, and the great adventure that my wife and I are after, are on. I think most excited about professionally, and this is going to sound self-serving, but I think that Born Lucky is really an opportunity to help a lot of people. And I've heard from thousands of people about the book and how much it's given them hope and ideas and understanding, and not just about autism, but about so many different things. And I've written back saying that I'm just honored to have them on the journey, because I think that's what this is. This is a journey that we're all on together, and so many parents are on, and so many parents feel like they're on alone, and Born Lucky is proof they're not alone.
But what advice would you give your younger self?
I think the most important advice I would have given my younger self is to love fully, right? Is to really understand how important that is, and to understand how important finding the right person is and what that means for you.
Do you have any book recommendations for us or for the listeners?
I'll toss out one that I've just read that I absolutely love is Jack Carr, the great former Navy SEAL, now New York Times #1 best-selling fiction author, wrote a nonfiction book called Target Beirut about the Beirut barracks bombing. And I think it's one of the most extraordinary nonfiction books I've read in a decade.
The name of our podcast is Nothing Left Unsaid. Do you have anything you want to say?
I would say the 240 pages of the book do pretty well.
All right, Leland.
I guess the only thing I could say to my dad is what I've said every day, which is, I love you, and I'll call you to say goodnight.
That's awesome. Leland, before we wrap up, I'm sneaking in one more question. I said the last question, but this is the real last question. At the end of every episode, we ask our guests, you kind of got to know us and know kind of the vibe of the podcast. Who are a couple of people that you know personally that you think we should try to have on as future guests?
Oh, that's a great question. I really like Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House. And I think you guys would be able to get some things out of him that would be really extraordinary. And obviously the faith component of this, I think, is really interesting. Mm-hmm. Trying to think of non-Washington. Mark Wayne Mullen, Republican senator from Oklahoma, really interesting guy, has lived many lives, and fascinating. And I'd have Jillian Michaels on.
Leland, thank you for reporting That Puts People Before Parties, for a memoir that tells the truth without flinching, and for reminding us that silence isn't weakness. It's just a beginning. You showed us that being born lucky isn't about ease, but endurance. May God bless you and your family, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you both, fellas. Thank you.
Yeah, this was awesome. Thanks so much. It's such a cool story, and obviously the kind of the hero of your book. And I got emotional earlier. Your dad sounds like such an unbelievable guy. So I hope he watches this, and thank you to Mr.
Well, I will tell him to. He's really loved being able to read some of the reviews and stuff, and it's made him feel like we're making a difference. So thank you guys.